We were last in the Temple of Jerusalem. I should have used the different background, the Temple of Jerusalem as the background, where Paul had been nearly mobbed by a Jewish mob. He was rescued by the Roman garrison who was stationed right next to the temple. And he was allowed to speak to the crowd, kind of giving a defense, which he really didn't defend himself against the accusations that they had. He really didn't say much about whether he had brought Gentiles into the temple. One of his later defenses, he does mention that, but for the most part, he's simply telling the story of how Jesus met him and commissioned him to carry a message. And so that message is what he's carrying in his defense. We can pick up the story then in Acts. Let's see, share screen. In Acts 22. In Acts 22:14, Paul is recounting the story of how he went to Damascus and Ananias met him. And we covered that last week, but I thought we could start with a review to kind of see, get positioned into the flow of the story. And this is something, Luke tells the story of Paul's conversion and call 3 times. And this one, he gives us more information than some of the information that the other 2 stories don't have, including the fact that Ananias was also involved in giving a commission to Paul. But Paul also gets his commission from a trance and vision, which is where we see in verse 17. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. So this was some kind of vision, some kind of supernatural revelation. So the Lord himself spoke to Paul, just as he did while he was on the road to Damascus. But here, kind of ironic here that Paul is accused of violating the sanctity of the temple. And so he goes back to a story of when he was in the temple and the Lord spoke to him there. And it's like the Lord accepted him and his presence in the temple, whereas the people did not. So the Lord spoke to him, verse 18, he says, quick, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. So that's kind of foreshadowing to the problem that Paul is facing right now, that people did not accept Paul's testimony about Jesus. This was years after the trance, but it certainly was true back then, and it's also true again. So Jesus told him to leave Jerusalem. So in verse 19, he kind of objects. He says, wait, I have such a good story to tell. Lord, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, this is certainly a touchstone. He keeps coming back to this story, a critical moment in his transformation. This exemplifies how evil he had been to the church. I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Says, this is such a great story. I want to be able to tell this to people who will appreciate it. But Jesus says, no. Verse 21, go. I will send you far away to the Gentiles. I've got something different in mind for you, because, go back to verse 18, the people will not accept your testimony. No matter what kind of story you tell of how zealous you were, they are not going to accept the story. So you might as well spend your time with somebody who will. And that's kind of what Luke has been describing all along. Paul tells the Jews, most of them reject him. And then he turns to the Gentiles, and Gentiles accept him, of course, but he finds greater success among Gentiles than among Jews. That's just kind of an irony in the way the Lord was working. But once Paul mentioned going to the Gentiles, verse 22, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." And there, I don't know, I was just looking at it today and I thought, oh, who were they shouting to? Were they shouting to the Romans? I suspect they were shouting to one another. You know, they were the Romans. The Jews would not be able to tell the Romans to execute a person on account of violating temple sanctity. Rome says, oh, you can execute the death penalty yourself in such cases. But they were telling each other, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. So, and of course, mobs are not known for being rational. Somebody comes out with some extreme statement, and the heat of the emotion, it kind of sways people. Verse 23, as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks. And why would they throw off their cloaks? I think it was the same reason they took their cloaks off when they stoned Stephen. They would enable them to throw the stones or not get their cloaks dirty or something. So like they were getting ready to tear Paul apart or kill him in some way. Throwing dust into the air is a sign of their disgust, of his blasphemy, maybe, whatever. It's part of the emotional stir of the moment. So, and the commander figured out that this was not a good scene. So verse 24, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. So Paul was basically in protective custody. But not very good protection, at least at first. Verse 24, the commander directed that Paul be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. And modern people find this so bizarre that here, the commander wants to find out why the people were shouting at him. What's this commotion about? The people are all confused. He doesn't want to answer that. So he wants to get an answer out of the accused. And in order to do that, he has him beaten mercilessly. But the medieval, the ancient world did that for millennia. I guess the theory was that when a person is under excruciating pain, they tell the truth. That might be true in some cases, but it is certainly a barbaric way to find the truth, and it is certainly an irony that, like, is this supposed to be justice? that you beat somebody that you don't even know what the charges are. You beat him to death. This is pretty strange. That's but anyway, so he wanted them to be flogged, have some kind of pain to find, supposedly that he would then tell the truth. He would not be trying to hide anything, and he just wants to blurt it out and to get this flogging over with or something like that. It's kind of an odd circumstance. But more recent ideas of justice have done away with that, we hope. Verse 25, as they were stretching him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" I guess the implied answer is no. And he's also implying that he himself is a Roman citizen, which he says so directly a little bit. But it's kind of ironic here that it's their idea of is it legal? This concept of legality comes up several times in the story. And is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen? Well, if it's not legal to flog a Roman citizen, why is it ethical to flog anybody else? Like their idea of ethics was based on whether or not a person was a citizen. Ethics varied according to whether you were upper class or you were, in the equestrian class or the plebeian class of Rome, or you were not a citizen at all. Whether you were a slave, whether you're a freedman, all these different categories of people had different levels of rights and non-rights, a lot of it.
Just a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, from this statement about not flogging the Roman citizen, it is good that Paul knew about this, that he is able to use a law to his advantage, that maybe to apply that as Christians, we don't just be like sheep, going to the slaughter, but using even all means, the law, to get away from that, That's what he did, right? That's basically, he used that to be saved in that instance.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple of commentators pointed out that Paul did not use or did not tell people, like in Philippi, another occasion, he did not tell people he was a citizen until after his rights had already been violated. And that way he put the person in charge in an embarrassing position. So that then Paul had more leverage with his claim to citizenship, I guess. But yeah, it's certainly, okay for a Christian to use rights that the government has given to us. We are simply, real justice by God's standards would require even more. So we are only claiming part by using human given rights. We are only claiming part of what is really valid. So we're not doing anything excessive. We're doing something that certainly should have been there all along.
The idea, Mike, of just came to my mind is law and order. I mean, that's a phrase that is often used a lot these days, like, I am for law and order. In some cases, in certain nations or countries, sometimes you cannot even trust the law. Sometimes the law can be violent, and so we cannot always say we can depend on it, because those who made the law, maybe the law is wrong, maybe it is unmerciful, all those. So for us Christians, maybe that's something to think about. Is the law in accordance to God's ways? Because the law may be, not good, maybe against what God teaches.
Right, and in a couple of verses, we'll see an example of where the law was not properly used. And the Romans prided themselves on having justice, but Luke is pointing out various injustices along the way. It's like, okay, go back to okay, yeah, Paul says, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen? The Romans, when the centurion heard this, verse 26, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man's a Roman citizen. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Paul said, yes, I am. And we still don't know how people would prove it. But there must have been some way to do it. Otherwise, it would have been falsely claimed many times. But verse 28, the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. And technically, citizenship was not for sale. You couldn't buy citizenship. The money he paid was for bribes, illegal bribes to get his citizenship. So there's an admission, and Luke could put that in, and the readers would understand, that these were bribes. This is the way Rome operated. That the provincial officials were often known for being bribed, for taking bribes. And if they did it too much, they might be kicked out. But this kind of thing went on. When you have autocrats, when there's the kind of power that kings had, that kind of thing is easy to happen and hard to stop, I guess. So the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money. I had to bribe several people to get my citizenship. But Paul said, well, but I was born a citizen. So therefore, Paul is kind of in a status above what the commander is. A little one-upmanship. It doesn't give him any more rights particularly, but it's just like, Paul was saying, I got mine in a legitimate way. Verse 30, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. That's a reasonable thing to do. The next day, he released Paul and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. He probably didn't have legal authority to require a formal assembly of the Sanhedrin, but he had the authority to summon them all. And it's me, I think it's kind of odd that he summoned so many. He's just asking for confusion if he asks more than one person. He knows that they're turmoil about it. Why not ask one person in charge, what's the deal here? What's going on? Get a straight answer. But he had all these Jewish leaders brought in, and he had brought Paul in, and Paul stood before the Jewish leaders. Verse chapter 23 then. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers, he presents himself as an equal to them. He doesn't say my brothers and fathers like Stephen did. But Paul sees himself at the same level because he was part of the leadership himself, had been. And Paul takes the initiative. He's not waiting for them to say, this is what he did. Paul, he gets the opening speech. It's possible the Jewish leaders did present their accusations, but the way the speech goes here, it doesn't sound like, and Luke could have admitted that. He omitted. He doesn't have to include everything. But Paul seems to take the initiative here, and he reframes the charges. In this speech, he doesn't say anything about, that he brought a Gentile into the temple. He is looking at it in a different way. He's saying, the reason so many people oppose me already, it's not, the reason they had such a stir about this concerns about Trophimus being in the temple, which he wasn't. The reason they have those concerns is because he doesn't like, they don't like what Paul is doing in particular. So Paul is kind of backing up, taking a bigger picture view of what the whole stir is about. Paul begins by saying, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Now, he obviously can't be including the stoning of Stephen in this. He certainly didn't have a good conscience about that now, but he seems to be referring to the recent events as to why he is on trial. He's like saying, okay, I plead innocent. Verse 2, at this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. And it's Paul reacted pretty strongly here. Verse 3, Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. That's similar to the hypocrite, somebody who's different on the inside than they are on the outside. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So here is the question of legality again. What does the law say? Are you going to follow the law or not? Apparently not. You know, you're acting illegally. And apparently this, from what, there's a couple of historians who wrote about Ananias, Josephus did, and mentions that he was a quick-tempered person, quick to anger. And so this is not out of character. This is something that we could easily see Ananias doing. So Paul responded kind of in kind, or well, maybe kind is not the right word, in the same tone. Probably startling enough that the people never actually hit him on the mouth. They would probably be taken aback at Paul's boldness in responding to the high priest. Those who were standing near Paul said, how dare you insult God's high priest? And Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest. And some people find that pretty hard to believe. Paul didn't know who the high priest was. There are a couple of possibilities there. One is that Paul didn't actually know that it was Ananias who said this. It was just out of the crowd. It was part of a crowd of people who were going to judge them. But he does say, you sit there to judge me. Paul seems to recognize that this person who spoke is kind of in charge. So the other explanation idea is Paul is speaking with irony. He's saying, you don't deserve to be high priest. I do not recognize you as the legitimate high priest. I didn't realize you were the high priest. The high priest should keep the law. And a third option is that Paul really didn't, was overreacting. Paul was not sinless. Some of his actions may have been not exactly exemplary. So there's several options there for how we might look at this interaction between Ananias and Paul. This is an interaction that Luke did not have to include at all. It doesn't really help his purpose. Well, it does show that the Jewish leaders are illegal. They are not interested in finding out the truth. They are simply interested in condemning and doing away with Paul. But Paul acknowledges, the scripture does say, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Now, Paul could sure turn that around too and say, well, who is the real ruler of the people? It's Jesus. And you guys are speaking evil about him. But he doesn't go there. This is just a quick comment and retort. Then Paul changes the subject, it seems. Verse 6. He brings up what in logic might be called a red herring. This is a controversy on another topic to divert attention away from where you really want it to be. He says he knows that some of them are Sadducees, others Pharisees. And he called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers. He knows this is going to create controversy. I'm a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I know that some of you are Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. He's saying that this is the real issue that has led to his the desire of the Jewish leaders to do away with him, and the reason he is being held in prison. It all started with his hope of the resurrection of the dead. And it's not just his hope, but also his conviction that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that Jesus was the beginning of the resurrection. But it kind of all stems from this hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assemblies was divided. And this is not surprising either. The way Josephus describes the Jewish leadership at the time, there were many divisions and factions. When the Jewish war started, more Jews were killed by other Jews than they were by the Romans. The Jews were fighting each other to the death. Different factions, one against another. All the Sadducees ended up being killed by one way or another because they were kind of pro-Roman. So if you rebel against Rome, the Sadducees are going to be one of the first groups you do away with. Or at least people who were Sadducees decide that they're no longer going to be Sadducees and kind of try to escape the bloodletting that went on there. The Pharisees were the only Jewish group that survived the war. And even they were severely decimated. And they had to regroup and reconfigure what Judaism was. Without a temple, everything had been changed. That's after the year AD 70. And it took the Jews, a couple, maybe 20 more years for them to regroup and find a new core of Judaism. And that is also when they decided that Christians were not Jews. They kind of drew the line there. They wanted to define Judaism more carefully because they had been so decimated by infighting that they couldn't tolerate opposing groups. They wanted a more clear definition. But here at this point, there's still a lot of tension, so it's not a big surprise that this dispute broke out. And the way it gets described is like there's a brawl going on between the Pharisees and Sadducees. The assemblies was divided. The Sadducees, and then Luke tells us, the Sadducees say that there was no resurrection. Everybody agrees on that. And he says that there are neither angels nor spirits. And the problem there is that the way Josephus describes it, the Sadducees did believe in angels. Angels are, after all, mentioned in the books of Moses. So there's people are kind of trying to figure out why Luke would say such a thing, or maybe how the grammar worked. And one way that seems to be the most plausible is that the Pharisees talked about resurrection, some as an angel, some as a spirit. And so the idea here is that the Sadducees are saying there is no resurrection, neither as an angel or as a spirit. They're ruling out all kinds of resurrections. But Luke says the Pharisees believe those things. That was a basic, an important difference in the beliefs of two major Jewish groups. Verse 9, there was a great uproar. And some of the teachers of the law, probably a minority, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if an spirit or an angel has spoken to him? Now, that was just adding gasoline to the fire. That was And they must have known that would do that too. Very, if you're arguing about such a thing, then, and here they are saying, well, what if? They have no evidence. They're just being pulled into the controversy and retorting with their own extreme, kind of defending their side of the view. Verse 10, the dispute became so violent, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. They must have been pulling at him or something. But it was quite a brawl by a supposedly legislative assembly. But then sometimes the English Parliament has had brawls in it too. We're not necessarily immune from people getting emotions out of hand and taking it out in a physical way. So verse 10, last part of verse 10, he commanded the troops to go down and take Paul away from them by force and bring him into the barracks, rescuing him from the Jewish leaders again. But the commander didn't get what he wanted. He didn't find out what the accusations were. What's this big fuss about? They obviously don't like him, but what is the story here? Verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul. The Lord spoke to him personally and said, take courage. You're going to need it. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. And maybe the implication is there, well, they're not going to like it much better than they did here in Jerusalem. But you will live to go to Rome. And that is something that Paul wanted to do. Verse 12, the next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Luke is really giving a lot of details here. It's kind of slowing down the action to bring out the most interesting part of the story, I guess. So here's some intrigue. They bound themselves with an oath to not eat or drink until they had killed Paul. And as we know, they failed in their plot. So what happened to their oath to not eat or drink? Well, obviously they broke their oath, and they probably had, they would have to make some kind of sacrifice for breaking their oath, but it's not like they had to starve themselves to death just because of that oath. They'd find ways around it one way or another. But at least initially there was this big plot to kill Paul. More than 40 men were involved in the plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have taken a solemn oath. It's interesting that they did this that these were not the chief priests and elders, but they were 40 other people who wanted to kind of take matters into their own hands, a vigilante group. And here they seek the approval of the chief priests and elders. All right, we've taken this oath. Now then, here's the plan. Verse 15, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander, ask the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. Whether the commander would have believed them or not, I don't know. The commander was probably pretty disgusted with the Jewish leaders by then. He said, we are ready to kill him before he gets here. So somewhere in the streets of Jerusalem, where the streets are kind of narrow, the 40 men would pile on Paul and kill him in some way. These were the days when they would carry daggers and kill people in the streets or in the temple courts even, taking their zeal for the law into their own hands. Verse 16, But when the son of Paul's sister, his nephew, heard of this plot, we know absolutely nothing about Paul's nephew or his sister. This is just popped into the story with no other explanation. Anyway, and we don't know exactly how old he was either. He heard of the plot. He went into the barracks and told Paul. How could he get into the barracks? Well, he may have been saying, well, he's bringing food to his uncle. Since Roman prisons generally didn't feed their prisoners, they expected other people to take care of them. So the nephew could have been taking food into Paul, and there he told Paul about the plot. So verse 17, then Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. Luke is putting in lots of details here. The commander took the young man by the hand. This suggests he was fairly young. Drew him aside and said, look, maybe as a young boy, I don't know, say 10 years old. That's just a guess. And he could have been found the Roman soldiers pretty intimidating. So the commander, it's like he doesn't want the boy to be intimidated. So he leads him by the hand, gets him away out of the problem. He probably gets down on his level and says, hey, what do you want to tell me? Verse 20, Paul's nephew said, some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting to get more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. They're ready now, waiting for your consent to their requests. Luke is not only slowing down the telling of the story, he's repeating the story. He's giving it some emphasis in this way, this plot against Paul. The commander, verse 22, the commander dismissed the young man with this warning: don't tell anybody that you've told me. So this plot that they wouldn't be alerted that, oh, the commander's onto him, things have changed. Those who were plotting would go ahead with their plot. Meanwhile, the commander is doing something else to completely thwart their plot. Verse 23, he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight, at nighttime. Some say this is kind of like, this is a force that's way bigger than needed. Well, perhaps. There were problems with ambushes around Jerusalem. So maybe this was not so out of the ordinary. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and the 200 spearmen. I left a little footnote number there. And the footnote in the NIV says, we don't know what this word means. The Latin translation, the old Latin translation says it was spearmen, but we really don't know what it meant. And it's possible that it did not include 200 spearmen at all. It may have been 200 something else, but we don't know. Anyway, it was a fairly good size, good number of troops. It's possible that the commander needed to send them to Caesarea at some point anyway, and that this was simply and sped up the plan, and they went at night. Partly to thwart this plan, to surprise anybody, and presumably there was like the moonlit night, something that they would be able to travel by night. with a full moon. And they go as far as we find out a little bit later to Antipatris, which is 36 miles away. Now, I walk about 3 miles an hour, so 36 miles is a pretty long trip for these 200 soldiers, and not as horsemen could easily do it, but the 200 foot soldiers would certainly find it difficult to go that far. So it's possible that the spearmen did not go as far as Antipatris. They simply went as escorted the group out of the danger zone around Jerusalem. And once they got onto a more open road, which an area that was better, more under the control of Roman soldiers, then they could have just proceeded with just the horsemen alone. It's hard to ambush people on horseback. And as it says in verse 24, provide horses for Paul. So Paul, horses, plural, interesting, for Paul. So Paul was on horseback as well. So this large group left to go to Caesarea. Well, they left at 9 at night. They would have traveled all night, basically. Provide horses for Paul so he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. And then the commander wrote a letter. And somebody said, this is the only secular letter we have in the New Testament. This from the commander to his boss. So we find out the commander's name, Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix, standard terminology for a governor. And the letter's short, most letters were. Even Paul's letter to Philemon, that's the shortest one we have, but it was long by first century standards. Most people didn't write letters that long. They just got to business and sent it off. So he says, verse 27, this man was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. Well, he's mixing the facts up a little bit there, make himself look better. So he didn't find out that Paul was a Roman citizen until later, after he had threatened to flog him. Verse 28, I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that their accusation had to do with questions about their law. It's not really in my domain. But there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment, at least it's not as far as Roman law goes. Verse 30, when I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. Well, that's true. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. And that's the end of the letter. The commander has not yet told the Sanhedrin to present their case, but presumably he would very soon, the next day, when he tells them, I sent Paul to Caesarea. Since he's a Roman citizen, he should be under the care of the boss. The commander was a commander of troops. He was not officially a judge. So he was saying that this matter requires a legal trial. So he sends him to the boss in Caesarea. Verse 31, the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night, brought him as far as Antipatris. That's kind of the halfway point. It was basically, even by horseback, it's a 2-day journey from Jerusalem to Caesarea. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him. They returned to the barracks, so they split up at some point. And they may have split up even before they got to the city of Antipatris. It could have been the area around Antipatris that they defined. They got to the area of Antipatris. It's the geographical markers aren't all that precise as we would like them to be. So when the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor, handed Paul over to him. That's to be expected. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. And there was some Roman law was starting to change about this time. At some point in the 2nd century, people were supposed to be tried in the province they were from. But in the 1st century, people were tried in the province where the offense occurred. And in a way, they were really part of the same province. Cilicia was part of the province of Syria at the time, and so was Judea. They're all under the same administration. So the Roman official in charge of Syria may not appreciate getting sent Paul when there's really no charge for imprisonment. It's really a strange case, kind of a story of injustice in many ways around. So, but he learned he was from Cilicia, and he said, well, I will hear your case. I'll take care of it when your accusers get here. So he's not passing him off somewhere else. He says, okay, I'll do it. He ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Now, if you're in prison, the palace is probably a pretty good place to be in prison. Not every area of the prison would be as nice. There might be a dungeon there somewhere, but Herod's palace was probably one of the better places to be. And certainly it was a place that was well guarded. The Jews would not be able to ambush him there. That's the end of one chapter. Any comments from anyone? Nope. I've noticed that the pace of the story picks up. Things are progressing. We're getting less theological speeches, and it's kind of the nature of the story is changing a little bit too. We're like in later chapters, it's just this travelogue. It's an exciting story of how they traveled and were shipwrecked. And well, I mean, we can comment on ship navigation methods and things like that, but it's not so much necessary, not much needed for Christian living. So
I have a question.
Yes.
Or maybe comment. Do you think that the nephew, learned it by accident, or was it God's, intervention? Because that way he went to Caesarea and then towards Rome. Or it was just like, divine intervention. And how come, if that was a secret, how come the nephew was able to discover it? Maybe there is, I think the 1st century Jewish community, they are, gossipers among them, right? Or gossip goes out quickly, even though they try to keep it a secret.
Well, it might be too, but also they didn't have windows. They had windows, but they didn't have glass. It was,
Cloth.
It was open, the windows were open air. That's how Eutychus could fall out the window.
Yeah. But they had curtains, right? Like a curtain maybe?
Yeah, they had curtains, but and they would, they'd probably ignore a young boy. Anyway, it's once, 40 people, it's pretty hard to keep a secret with 40 people. Somebody finds out, one guy tells his wife or his son, or, its story gets out.
Oh yeah, because they promised not to eat and drink, and so there will be questions. Why are you not eating or drinking?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, don't cook anything for me tonight.
Okay.
And was it an accident? Well, we don't know. Probably not. Jesus had told Paul that he would definitely go to Rome.
Oh, yeah.
So, he was going to make sure that one way or another, that this is the way it happened. Whether there may have, God may have had other things up his sleeve too. if God has sleeves.
Can you explain what you mentioned about? You notice you said that the story is changing. There isn't much of as before. It's getting a little more like a secular story. Could you explain that?
Yeah, it's not evangelistic speeches. Paul is not preaching evangelistic messages anymore. He does tell the story of his conversion to the Jews here, but he's not. Well, even in for one of the Roman governors too, I think it's Felix. That says, "Well, you almost persuade me to be a Christian." So Paul is getting into some of that, but a lot of this story, the details of Paul's nephew, of telling the story of the plots twice, some of that repetitions, those are secular items. They don't seem to be. It's a different phase of Paul's ministry in a way.
No, it is the same author, right? I mean, the same.
Oh yeah. There's no question on that. Nobody has suggested that there is a different author. Sometimes they'll suggest that Luke was using different sources here and there, but I don't think they suggest that for this particular change.
Maybe being a pastor, maybe if I sermonize that situation, I would say it doesn't mean that because there was less evangelism that God is less involved.
Yeah.
God is still there, and He's just letting the story flow.
Right. Is God involved in the shipwreck? Well, yeah. Luke doesn't talk about specific acts of divine intervention, but the overall flow of the story is, yes, that God was superintending that to make sure that Paul made it to Rome.
Can I ask another question? Can I go back to the Sadducees?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that there are certain Bible scholars who said that actually the Sadducees believe in the resurrection.
No. Oh, well, no, not really the resurrection. I hope I didn't say that. Sadducees did believe in angels, because angels are mentioned in the books of Moses, which was the authoritative standard that the Sadducees went by. So they would have believed in angels. When Jesus argued with the Sadducees about the resurrection, he did use the law of Moses, but he used it in a way that would have surprised anybody. And the Pharisees did not use that argument that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. That was a new twist in the argument, as it were, and Jesus caught them off guard by that. But he was using the scriptures that the Sadducees said, yeah, those are authoritative. And he was using that, kind of against them. Haven't you read this? But yeah, it's the way Josephus describes it in their, I forget the name of another ancient writer who describes the Jewish sects. But both of them are in agreement that the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. In that, one of the books written between the Testaments is called The Wisdom of Ben Sirach, which is similar to a book of Proverbs. It has a number of proverbs, probably from 2nd century BC, and it's apparently from the Sadducee viewpoint because it says there is no resurrection.
It's kind of interesting, and maybe I should study more about what the Sadducees believe with the reward of the righteous. They don't believe in the resurrection, and they are, the Sadducees supposedly the righteous group, right?
Yeah.
It's their name, the righteous ones.
At least I think, you know, I think they thought the reward of the righteous was in this life. The righteous people would be blessed with power and wealth, just like we have. So we must be righteous.
Okay. Works.
Yeah, that's, it was a kind of a deistic view where, you know, yes, there is a God, but he's not really that much involved in what's going on. And then, you know, he's not going to deal with anything in the future. And the Pharisees said, you know, that is precisely, you know, people who are righteous are often persecuted for it. The story of the Maccabean martyrs, you know, they were zealous for the law and yet they were killed. How is God going to be righteous to them? The only way that he can, you know, bless them for their faithfulness is by resurrecting them. And so that kind of the injustices that we see in this world were part of the rationale for why the Pharisees believed in a resurrection. The Old Testament doesn't say a lot about it. There's a half dozen verses that talk about a resurrection, but some of those are disputed. But the beliefs in resurrection really took on more a bigger view after, you know, between the time of the two testaments. That's when they started to emphasize those Old Testament scriptures that did talk about it, like the book of Daniel. Daniel 12:1 is the strongest one, I guess. That they'll arise from the dust, some to be like shining like stars.
And Ezekiel, you know, the bones, the flesh and the bones coming together.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, they interpreted that metaphorically too, but you know, some there. Anyway, beliefs about resurrection became larger in this time between the testaments, and they developed more elaborate concepts of the angelic world, the spirit world, and the Sadducees rejected all of that speculation about resurrection and about angelic hierarchies. They had it simpler.
Kind of curious, the present Judaistic religion, are they leaning Sadducees or Pharisees or totally different?
They are descendants of the Pharisees. So they, after the Jewish war, then the Pharisees regrouped in Galilee and then later at Jatna, also in Babylon. The great Jewish work, the Talmud, was compiled in Babylon. That's where Rome never had the power to persecute them. So the Jewish community continued in Babylon quite well. That's the bigger Talmud. Jerusalem also had its own Talmud. But all of these are collections of what the rabbis of earlier centuries said. And some of them will go back to Rabbi Gamaliel said such and such. Rabbi Hillel said such and such. And all these legends about the teachings of the rabbis are kind of just blended together into a big mush. And it's difficult to sort them out as to when beliefs or how beliefs developed and when they developed. And there have been a couple of attempts. People have gone through the Talmud and say, all right, this rabbi lived before AD 70. And so they've gone back and collected some of those. And so they will have a book on beliefs of the Jews before AD 70 and those different groups of how they were involved. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls describe the doctrinal controversies between Sadducees and Pharisees, and the people in the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to have been spin-offs of the Sadducees, but they differed with them at a number of points too. And it's a bit hard to decipher that because they write in such strange symbolism that who are they writing about? And so it's we scholars look at it and try to make a guess as to who they are writing about and who this teacher of righteousness is and what the deal was, who the lawless one in the temple was. It seems to refer to some split in the origin of the group. Anyway, so that some of those writings from back then help scholars piece together, and for the most part, it's not giving new information, but it's helping confirm the information we had from Josephus and others as to what these different groups believed. We don't have any writings directly saying, I'm a Sadducee and here's what we teach. That has to be pieced together from the writings of their enemies.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, that's I mean, yeah, that's a could be a whole semester long course in Judaism.
Yeah.
Look at some of those writings, some of them interesting and some of them just kind of infuriating as to how they argued so much over picayune little details. But sometimes Christians do that too. Oh, well.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. See you Sunday.
Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you.